Hello, good evening. It is a pleasure to see so many faces out here tonight for this screening and this conversation. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm a professor here at the Journalism School and the director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism, which, along with the Knight First Amendment Institute and the Center for Palestine Studies here at Columbia University, are all co-sponsoring tonight's event. It's my honor to welcome you tonight to this screening and discussion about the film The Encampments and a discussion about the largest student protest movement since the Vietnam War and the fight for free speech. Before we begin, I just want to affirm a few basic principles. First, that we intend to have a respectful discussion where everyone feels welcome and has the space to participate. We'll have time for questions. And I don't think this needs to be said, but I just want to state it clearly. We will continue to welcome diverse viewpoints in our classrooms, and we value all students, no matter their religion, nationality, gender identity, ethnicity, ability, or age. Students from around the world have been such a robust part of this campus, and we welcome that tonight. And I ask that everyone be respectful, not just throughout our conversation, but when it's time for a Q&A. I'd like to introduce one of tonight's panelists who will be delivering some introductory remarks before the screening of the film. Nadia Abul-Hajj, who is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of Anthropology and the co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies, will deliver an introduction in just a moment. Panelists later, after the film, will also include her, as well as Ramya Krishnan, the senior staff attorney at the Knight First Amendment Institute, who led the Institute's litigation in AAUP v. Rubio, a challenge to the Trump administration's policy of deporting non-citizen students and faculty who participated in pro-Palestinian advocacy. With that, let's please give a big round of applause for Nadia Abul-Hajj.
Hello, good evening, everyone. These will be very short because we do have a movie to watch. My opening remarks would have been very different a week ago. In late September, a few of us met to organize a screening of The Encampments on Columbia's campus, a documentary that centers the courage and moral clarity of Columbia and Barnard students who, after protesting against Israel's genocide in Gaza for nearly an entire academic year, established an encampment in front of Butler Library, and in so doing, ignited a student encampment movement far and wide. The film screening was to be followed by a panel discussion during which Mahmoud Khalil was to speak. A Columbia graduate of immense integrity, Mahmoud has paid an enormous price for his role in the student movement. Taken from his apartment building by unidentified men, whisked off in an unmarked car, he then spent 104 days in a Louisiana ICE detention center, during which time he missed the birth of his first child, a son. Released as per an order by a federal judge, Mahmoud is now still fighting a deportation order. In contrast to other universities and university presidents who spoke out in defense of their students detained by ICE, Tufts, Georgetown, for example, Columbia has done no such thing. It offered him no support prior to his arrest, and it has offered no support since, which has been true of other Columbia students arrested as well, or detained. Adding insult to injury, now they won't allow him on campus. They have refused his entry onto campus and his participation in this event for, quote unquote, security reasons, unspecified and patently spurious. Columbia does not want Mahmoud to speak, and security is their alibi, borrowing the playbook, it seems, of many an authoritarian regime. In light of Columbia's refusal to allow Mahmoud to join us today, we struggled with whether or not to go forward with the event. Right or wrong, we came to the conclusion that canceling would be worse. We would be giving Columbia what it really wants, silencing not only Mahmoud, but also the very speech and politics of the student movement that the film, The Encampment, documents. Mahmoud will speak here on campus tonight, but he will do so in and through the film. The Encampment is the story of an astonishing movement that took to campuses in the first year of the Gaza genocide. And that struggle to end the genocide in Gaza, to stop the ever-escalating violence in the West Bank, and to demand a free Palestine is far from over. There is no ceasefire, at least not if that requires the Israeli military to actually cease firing. And there is no peace plan That is, if peace is to mean anything other than the replication of a 19th century imperial fantasy as it meets a Trumpian corrupt real estate deal. So in the spirit of recognizing students who have put so much on the line, and with a view towards helping to keep that movement and message alive, we have decided to go forward tonight. The film is about an hour and 20 minutes long, after which we will have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's a pleasure to see you. I've introduced both of our panelists here today already, so I'm not going to reintroduce them. But I do want to start with you, Nadia, about something that this film is very clear about. It frames itself early on as a response to, what is seen as a dominant narrative. You see the film opens with clips from news media and characterizations of these student protests. And you very quickly see that this is the story of student protesters in their own words, told by them. And it really asks you, what are we taking for granted? Or, what is a counter response here? And one of the things that I, as a journalist, have thought, as I have looked at a lot of dominant narratives or narratives in general about war, is just the incredible toll that witnessing and exploring war has taken on people, young people who are watching it. I don't know if a lot of you know, but I am a reporter myself, and I've spent, much of the last decade reporting on civilian casualties, largely from U.S. airstrikes in war zones. And that work, I think it changes your soul, speaking to survivors, witnessing carnage, spending time with families. I think that it changes you as a person. And one of the things that struck me immediately, as this war began and this carnage unfolded was, wow, I had to spend so much time preparing how to take care of myself as I did this work, thinking about how I would channel the feelings I felt into doing a lot of reporting. And I just kept thinking, what are these students and young people who are consuming and watching these videos in real time? How are they feeling? And, you hear that quote from Sueda early on, I could either be paralyzed and depressed or be involved. And that question of taking for granted what is essentially unprecedented in terms of scale in modern warfare. I've covered so many wars, and in the very first week of the aerial campaign in Gaza, there were 6,000 strikes in 6 days in a matter of a week. I've never seen that in Iraq and Syria by the United States, and the tens of thousands of airstrikes that they carried out over a very long period. I've never seen such pace or scale or such video and such imagery in real time. And I just want you to start with the effect that has had on students and their moral conscience and this idea of moral injury.
Incompetent here. Hi. Look, I think that's a really important question, because for all the sort of, the general reception of this outside Columbia's gates and in the press, it was almost as if this was some combination of some ideological conspiracy and brainwashing. But a lot of people were really overwhelmed early on. First of all, I think it's really important to understand that we have a lot of students who actually have family in Gaza, and they were beginning to lose relatives from the get-go. I mean, a former PhD student of mine who was still here, within the first 2 weeks lost 16 relatives, right? So you had that sort of group of people who had a very direct connection. And you had, I think, a lot of young people who were overwhelmed precisely by the scale of the violence, which was unprecedented, and which continued to be. And as the year went on, it was very striking, the toll that not just that the slaughter was taking on these students, but also that the activism was. And it very quickly became a sort of showdown between the Columbia administration. Our dearest Minouche Shafi appointed a special security committee on October 8th, I think, in which there was no faculty involvement, which changed the rules and of sort of protest rules, et cetera, and really cracked down on student groups and on demonstrations and just kept escalating. So it really felt like the pressure was coming from both sides, from the reality of the war that people were seeing live streamed on social media, and from the administration that was entirely unsympathetic to the students who were protesting and to any idea that there was pain on the side, on that side, as opposed to people who were Jewish or Israeli and had their own reactions to October 7th. And that asymmetry created a crisis that I don't think we had to get to, but that we got to very, very quickly. And I think the emotional toll has been immense, and the real toll. I mean, a lot of the punishments that have been meted out are so disproportionate to anything that has ever happened at this university. In 1968, one student was expelled. That was an occupation that lasted much longer and actually involved a lot more property destruction. This has never happened before. It's this particular issue.
Speaking of 1968, I just want to make another documentary plug. If you have 7 hours to spare, there is a documentary called A Time to Stir that chronicles in incredible detail the protests here on Columbia's campus over that time period. And it's really, I think, gripping to see how it's covered today, how it's talked about today. And when you go and look back at history about tactics, techniques, it's really, many people, experts and scholars will tell you that recent history looks tame compared to those protests. And if you have those 7 hours, I would encourage you to watch that. I wanted to follow up because, early on in November of 2023, when Columbia announced this decision, this special safety committee announced this decision to suspend two student groups, SJP and JVP, and they cited in their official statement threatening, intimidating rhetoric. I set out to sort of try to understand. As a reporter, I was just trying to understand, what is behind this decision? What happened here? Who's making it? And, I had several sources tell me that there were some trustees who were pushing for the expulsion of these two groups, and that suspending them was seen as a middle ground. And I tried to learn more about the trustees and that decision-making process. And one of the first things I did was I scraped about 30 years of trustee data. And I went to go look, how many of these trustees over this history have been Muslim or Arab or have deep or meaningful experiences in these communities, because I'd just like to understand the decision-making and the expertise involved. And I was hard-pressed to find anyone. And I wanted to ask you, we've seen a number of, you describe them as asymmetries, there is, and Minouche Shafiq references it here, the lessons she's learned from the university's anti-Semitism task force and its recommendations and the ways in which it has grappled with questions of anti-Semitism, but there was no parallel task force that looked at questions of anti-Palestinian bias or that grappled with questions of Islamophobia or other kinds of discrimination that some students have cited, yet they have really arresting experiences. What have you seen when it comes to the ability to have space, to have conversations, not only just to, for example, to screen a film like this, but to have a real and honest conversation in which people can speak up and describe what they're feeling?
I should say, I never turned it off, I swear to God. Okay. There we go. Okay. There was, I should say, after the Anti-Semitism Committee was set up, Minouche Shafiq did reach out to one or two people about an Islamophobia task force. And the response was, that is not, first, there were several people who said no. And the reason was, there were multiple reasons. One was Islamophobia was not the right framework. There was no possibility of thinking about Islamophobia and anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism. And the second reason was I think, right, which is that it would never have been, well, first of all, the second reason was their argument was, well, if you want to have a task force about discrimination, it should be one task force, and we should discuss across these issues. And one can see Harvard had an anti-Semitism task force and an Islamophobia task force. And if you actually look at the data, far more Muslims, and I think it was Arab and I think it was both Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, far more, it was like 88% of students at Harvard who were either Arab and or Muslim felt discriminated against and harassed on campus, as opposed to, I don't remember what the number was for Jewish students, but it was 50 or 60% at most. But the headlines were all about the anti-Semitism. It was never going to garner the kind of public coverage or response. And so my sense from students is, one of the things that we kept getting told, I feel like I've spent my life as an advisor to students in OIE hearings in the last 2 years, let alone disciplinary hearings. What we constantly are told is, well, we're not hearing from Muslim students and Arab students and Palestinian students in the same volume, and their parents aren't the ones calling us. And what we keep saying is, yeah, because they don't trust you. They don't think you're going to do anything. And many of these students' parents are immigrants to the US. They don't feel the same sense of entitlement, for lack of a better word, to just call up and yell at university administrators, right? So that also has really skewed the data in a profound way. And a lot of students have said they're not going to report. They don't trust the administration and these offices to do anything. And in fact, it is true that that was the outcome. I mean, the most obvious cases, there were probably 40 or 50 complaints against Shai Davidai that were well documented. A professor on campus who was harassing students, and he was never held to account. So there's a reason people aren't. And that kind of alienation just perpetuates the problem.
I want to ask about, before I'll come to you, but I wanted to ask about Mahmoud Khalil, who, you see his role here in the film as a lead negotiator, and you hear him, actually, there's this great scene where you hear him respond to, what would you do if you were deported? And it's so prescient in so many ways about what was to come. But there's a lot of reporting, including in student newspaper like The Spectator, about how Mahmoud Khalil had reached out to the university for help. That there were these crackdowns on students, that he felt unsafe, and he had emailed the university before he was arrested. Can you describe, what that felt like in the lead up to that, and what we're going to get to in just a moment, but what it was like when you have a student or a former student in this case, who is asking for help, who is being harassed, who is the subject of very targeted campaigns and calls, like even in real time for his deportation. What was that experience in terms of not being able to get that response, as he and his lawyers have said?
So I should say Mahmoud reached out a couple days before he was actually detained, asking for some kind of protection. He was in university housing, but not on campus, and he'd get zero response. I wasn't in conversation with him. The person I ended up in, because I think it sort of came very fast. After his arrest, Mohsen Mahdawi spent 3 weeks trying to get a response out of the university, asking them to move him onto campus, so that, because at that point, at least, the gates were locked, as we know, and the university was not going to let ICE on campus without a warrant, without a judicial warrant, which they didn't have when they picked people up. And it was impossible. He was getting more and more desperate. He didn't leave his apartment for 3 weeks. The president's office, the housing office response was, we don't move, what was it? Something about graduate students on campus, but he wasn't a graduate student. That can't be it. I don't remember. But it was a very bureaucratic response to why he couldn't be moved on campus. And there was also a sense of, they just didn't want to get themselves, there was a bit of a sense of, if he's going to be arrested, he's going to be arrested, and we don't want to put ourselves in the middle of this. And it was very desperate, and it was very frustrating that nobody would step up and try to protect him in any way. The other things, the university never seemed to offer any of these students, as far as I know, legal help or legal counsel in these situations. So it was, and Mahmoud's arrest also really broke a lot of students, right? He was the person also, you'll notice over time more and more students masked up. And then it was like, well, we can't have masked students on campus, it's dangerous. Well, first they started masking up because of doxing. I mean, people were getting, I have a former MA student here who actually lived in Brooklyn, and after being doxed, had a note stuck under the apartment building door that said, I know where you live, sleep with one eye open. And then they started masking up because the university was cracking down on them, right? And Mahmoud never put on a mask. He was very public. He, as much as it says, what will you do if you get deported? He didn't really think that would happen. He had a green card, and he wasn't engaging in anything but political speech, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind as the university turns masking into some nefarious plot, because there are real dangers of having your face shown, and increasingly so, although it is worth pointing out that entire film is during the Biden administration, so when we all get hysterical about Trump authoritarianism, let's be very clear. This started long before Trump. I know that's an aside.
So, and there will be time for questions, so keep them, be thinking. So March 8th, Mahmoud gets picked up, and you're referencing this time period, but there was such a climate of fear, across the university, one of which was this incredible moment in which our international students, no matter whether they were protesters or not, one of our students, helped break the story of Mahmoud Khalil's arrest, one of the very first to publish, and had to keep her name off the story because she was an international student. And you could see this pervasive. Some students were afraid to come to classes. There was this incredible culture of fear, and then this drumbeat of arrests. And this was really, by March 25th, the Knight Institute and AAUP launches this incredible litigation. Can you just describe that drumbeat of arrests, that climate of fear that led you all to take on this monumental case?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, by the time we had filed suit, of course, we'd seen Mahmoud be arrested, which itself, as Nadia mentioned, sent chills down the spine of our academic community and was already terrifying many of the most vulnerable members of our community into silence. And by the time we filed suit, it was clear that his arrest was not going to be a one-off. So we had seen Georgetown postdoctoral fellow Badr Khan Suri. He was arrested outside of his home in Virginia. Yonseo Chung, a Barnard student, had been forced into hiding. And then the very day we filed suit, Rumeysa Ozturk, a Tufts grad student, was snatched off a public street in Somerville, Massachusetts, by this group of masked ICE agents in plain clothes, and then quickly hustled into this unmarked van. And then days after we filed suit, Mohsen Madawi was arrested at his scheduled naturalization interview, no less. And through all of this, the administration was making clear in public statement after public statement that they were arresting these individuals because of their political speech, and that more arrests were to come. So people were terrified, and we saw, many foreign students and faculty powerfully chilled. They were avoiding political protests. They were purging their social media. Many were declining to publish scholarship or public writing that they feared could put themselves in the administration's crosshairs. Many were declining to travel internationally, even when that travel was necessary to advance their study and research. And many were self-censoring in the classroom. I spoke to many teachers who have modified their syllabi or have decided to not teach entire courses altogether because they're afraid that doing so could increase the risk of them being deported. And this has harmed US citizens as well, because they're then deprived of the insights and engagement of their non-citizen colleagues and students. So the reason we filed suit is we wanted to end this campaign of intimidation, and we wanted to make it clear, we wanted the courts to make it clear that no student or faculty members should have to live in fear that ICE agents are going to turn up at their homes and seize them simply for engaging in lawful political expression.
So this speech, the pro-Palestinian advocacy and speech that is at the center of the suit, which challenges the administration's policy of arresting, detaining, and deporting non-citizen students and faculty who participate in pro-Palestinian activism. You know, in this litigation, you make the argument that this is protected speech and that applies to non-citizens, and that, you know, as you've discussed previously, that it is this today, it could be something else tomorrow. Can you describe sort of what it means to have this sort of ideological deportation take effect and the ways in which, if left uncontested, that could manifest?
Yeah, I mean, it's no surprise that they started with non-citizens here. I mean, they're among the most vulnerable people in this country. But if we let the federal government use immigration law as a cudgel in this way, then no non-citizen can, you know, every non-citizen will live in fear that their words will displease those in power. And today it is pro-Palestinian advocacy, but there's no limiting principle to the government's argument here. They have vigorously maintained throughout our litigation that they can deport non-citizens at any time, you know, for engaging in political speech that would clearly be protected if a US citizen engaged in it, because they say that non-citizens are different when it comes to the First Amendment. And they have invoked, I mean, they invoked in Mahmoud's case and they invoked in other cases as well, these foreign policy provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which give the Secretary of State very broad power to deport individuals that they deem to be a foreign policy risk. And so they have declared now, well, we have a foreign policy of combating anti-Semitism worldwide. Well, you know, tomorrow they could declare a foreign policy of, you know, promoting fossil fuels or, you know, declaring their support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then that could be used to suppress all kinds of other speech, including speech that they deem to promote DEI or speech that is supportive of gender-affirming care. And I think that that's a very, very dangerous road to go down.
This litigation brought forth, you know, as so many people were trying to understand, well, what is the process behind the rationale of this deportation, of these deportation efforts? You know, how is the State Department involved? We had an understanding of, you know, the New York Times would get the memo that used, you know, to justify the revocation of visa status of Mohsen Madawi, but we didn't really have an understanding of the exact process through which that took place. And I think one of the most fascinating things about this trial was how much we learned. Like, it was just full of revelations about that process. And can you just describe some of the things we learned about, you know, how these students were found? You know, what kind of teams, like the Tiger team, involved, and, you know, how it made its way to the State Department? What did we learn from this case? And before we even get to what it resulted in, just tell us what we learned while it was going on.
Yeah, well, we did learn a lot. I mean, in some ways, you know, it confirmed what we knew all along, that they were targeting these people based solely on their political speech. But we learned many new details about the scope and intensity of their campaign. So we learned that shortly after President Trump issued these executive orders on foreign terrorism and combating anti-Semitism, that DHS and the State Department sprang into action. DHS, and in particular the component of it called Homeland Security Investigations, which traditionally has been all about, you know, dismantling transnational criminal organizations focused their efforts, launched this operation to identify student protesters for possible referral to the State Department, which would then make a determination to revoke visas, or in the case of green card holders like Mahmoud, to make this determination of removability, which basically kicks off that person's deportation. And the way they did this was they directed their Office of Intelligence to scour these lists of suspected protesters from these shadowy pro-Israel sites like Canary Mission. And then they produced these intelligence reports on hundreds of student protesters, which repeated these unvetted, unsupported allegations taken wholesale from these organizations' websites that these students were, quote unquote, anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas. And I mean, the scale of this operation was pretty astonishing. I mean, they were asked to review the profiles of all 5,000 people on Canary Mission's website to find appropriate candidates for deportation. And this was in no way limited to student protesters that they had suspected of being engaged in any kind of criminal activity. They were focused on these people because they were engaged in protest activity. And so you had these reports that then went to the National Security Division of HSI, and they would then send these referral letters, which were essentially boilerplate in nature, to the State Department, purporting to summarize actions taken by these students that, quote unquote, violated President Trump's executive orders on anti-Semitism. And then ask the Secretary of State to make this determination that they were a foreign policy risk so that then they could then be deported. And so these letters then went to the State Department as part of this new referral process that was meant to fast track these people, including Mahmoud, for deportation. And the State Department would consider what to do. And the testimony we heard from government officials is they never received any guidance as to what actually constitutes anti-Semitism or support for terrorism. But we heard from the senior State Department official, John Armstrong, and he's the man who personally decided to revoke Ramesa's visa, who made the recommendation to Marco Rubio to, start the process for revoking the green cards of all of these other individuals. And he was asked squarely, what his understanding of anti-Semitism and support for terrorism was. And he said very clearly, and this was some really striking testimony, that criticism of Israel, including its actions in Gaza, is possible grounds for deportation from this country. He was asked about a series of statements. Is criticism of Zionism grounds for deportation? Yes. Is calling for an arms embargo on Israel possible grounds for deportation? Yes. Is saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is that grounds for deportation? Yes. He even said that criticizing the Trump administration's actions and policies towards Israel is possible grounds for deportation. So I feel like that says everything. I mean, it was clear from public statements they were making all the time that they were conflating, legitimate pro-Palestinian and anti-war advocacy with anti-Semitism, but it was another thing entirely to hear it straight from their mouths.
Yeah, he was a very forthcoming witness, and I would encourage you to dig deeper into some of these revelations. The Knight Institute has a great article actually up. It's called "Landmark Trial Ends with Court's Ruling to Come. Record Uncovers New Details on Ideological Deportation Policy and Its Effects on Academic Life." I just realized you're not going to Google that. I'll put it on my Instagram story or something. But it's a great sort of rundown of a lot of this and the TikTok of that. And I would really encourage you to look at it more deeply because, there's a real link between what you've seen in the film, the speech in the film, to what people were arrested for. And, one of the State Department memos, the one about Mohsen Madawi, actually cited in it that he was involved in, quote, threatening, intimidating rhetoric. I mentioned that earlier because that was language used in that original suspension that I mentioned from November of 2023. And I remember when I saw that memo comes out, and I have such specific recollection of being like, no, I remember this was cited in that suspension. And I remember, I think it was even a source at the State Department confirmed to the New York Post that same day that this memo came out, like even Colombia accused him of threatening, intimidating rhetoric. We got it from them. And I remember sitting back and being like, the only instance I have ever seen them use this phrase, and I went and I did a scrape. I'm a journalist. Okay, I did a scrape, and there was no other reference to that specific language. And it was, amidst, there have been all of these accusations hurled about whether or not universities have abetted or aided some of the rationale used in these deportations. And while that was not attributed specifically in that memo, it was very clear to reporters who were digging into this that there was, at least in this instance, you could see a line. And the great irony of all of this is I did ask Manoush Shafiq this because she came to the journalism school for a breakfast with the faculty, and of course we peppered her with questions. And the question I asked her was about, she said, we have never punished anyone for their speech. And I said, but in your suspension, you wrote this threatening, intimidating rhetoric as a justification. And she said, that was because there was protest one day and someone said something that was anti-Semitic, and we learned only later he was not affiliated with the protests. And it was a scene that played out in which someone did say something anti-Semitic, and this is a scene you can watch yourself. It's in a 60 Minutes interview that Mohsen did, where someone said something anti-Semitic and he told them that was wrong. And the great irony is that what a situation in which he actually addressed anti-Semitism, called it anti-Semitism, and said it was wrong, was what ultimately wormed its way into this deportation memo, this justification from Rubio. And I want to turn to you, as we think about sort of, it's not just our government, it's sort of the connections that we can make in the instances where you have that evidence between, what can we be doing? And it's our job to safeguard the freedom of speech. As faculty here, as we are living through what is, a deal from the administration with the university and promises made by our administration that we are going to protect academic freedom and protect the First Amendment and, the need for inquiry. How have you seen that play out in the time since this deal has been struck in your own work for the Center for Palestine Studies and then in the communities that you work in?
Well, I think it's early days still, and we're going to, by the end of this year, have a much clearer sense of how this is going to play out. But I want to say two things. One is, we couldn't quite get a straight answer out of one of the university lawyers that some faculty met with, but the decision to allow anonymous complaints to Title VI is, as far as I have been able to derive, not actually required by federal law. And I want us to think about what that does, right? So anybody can make a complaint. You don't have to be, you can do it anonymously. You don't have to be a student. You can be anybody in the country. The ADL has made a complaint, et cetera. So I'm going to tell you the following story, which is a colleague in the history department finds out that there have been 2 complaints lodged against her, both anonymous, one anonymous by a student that was in the class, one anonymous about another anonymous student who was a friend of the anonymous reporter who was in the class. The complaints basically were as follows. It was October 9th, 2 days after, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but they were almost identical. 2 days after the anniversary of the horrific attacks of October 7th, and I'm in this class on European history, and one of the texts we read referred to Israel as a colonial project, and the other one said to the colonization of Palestine, and that they were deeply upset by this, it had really shaken them, blah, 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 please look into it. So the reports are brought to her, and she's like, oh. The text in question was Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State. Okay. Leaving aside the problem
Just in case they don't know who Theodor Herzl is.
The founder of political Zionism in the 19th century, and he was actually responding to the Dreyfus Affair and the problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. So there's some level at which it's funny, you can't make this shit up. But at another level, it's not, because there's now this record. Of course, the case was dismissed once the text was discovered. But this is on the record. It creates a paper trail, right? And we've been assured, oh, no, the government will never be able to subpoena that paper trail. Really? What if this person was not a US citizen? What if this person was an assistant professor and not tenured? The point is, they've basically institutionalized doxing via Title VI, and it's endless harassment and extremely consequential. So lots of people are going to change what they're teaching because if nothing else, you just don't want to deal with it, right? The other thing I was just going to say, which I think, I'd had a conversation with somebody in the AAUP recently, who's actually here, and who'd asked me, what are we seeing? And I went home that night and it hit me. What we're seeing is the use of security. Security is the way they're doing the end run. Basically, they keep telling faculty, no, nothing in this agreement with the federal government and nothing in our adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is going to interfere with your academic freedom. Really? We tried to invite Mahmoud tonight. Besides denying Mahmoud his free speech, it's saying, as faculty, we don't have the right to invite whoever we want to speak. They're going to vet it. But they're not going to say to us, it's because we don't like the content of his speech. They're going to say it's a security risk. And that I am seeing, and I know from another event, events that touch in any way on criticism of Israel are much more likely, in CPS events, to go through security hell, so to speak, to get people on campus. That's what I think that's going to be the tactic.
This is the first time of, the dozens of events that we've done here at the journalism school over the last 2+ years that, I've encountered, I think, the process that you're describing in which security was grounds for not allowing a speaker to be here in person at the journalism school. Other venues elsewhere, but not here. And I'd never previously experienced that. And just to give you all some context as well, I think it was also the first time I've received messages asking me to cancel an event. And I just want to read a portion of one that I received via email from a former student who wrote that I am deeply upset that Columbia is hosting a screening of the Encampments, which, he says, quote, glorifies a movement which subjected me and many others to the repeated hate crimes on Columbia's campus less than 2 years ago. He goes on to say that he was repeatedly harassed, chased, threatened with death, and assaulted, often for as little as wearing a yarmulke while crossing College Walk to get to class. And that the movie covers up and excuses all of this. And on that basis, he said, I ask that you please remove the film screening from this event and conduct a thorough review to ensure a mistake like this isn't repeated. I've never received an email like this. I understand there are various perspectives on, what we saw here in the film, what dominant narratives may be, but it was my first time experiencing that. And you bring up security, as a rationale for how this is often done. I want to ask you a little bit more. There have been recent student groups that have tried to hold events. What do you know about their efforts to be able to create space where people can feel comfortable to have these conversations or to even hold them in the first place?
Having been on leave all of last year and feeling like I'm barely back, I don't know a lot. I know that there was an event a little over a week ago. It was Harvest Festival that was canceled at the last minute. People in the audience are nodding. And I think it was also on some kind of a security grounds, but I'm not sure. But it was, sorry? An hour before, right.
On the basis that some social media account posted about the event that they don't approve of.
Oh, right. Right. So now also, so remember also one of the agreements that Columbia made with the feds and Barnard made with a private, in settling a suit, is that under no circumstances will they ever speak to anyone associated with Quad or with any group that has ever been associated with Quad. Well, if that's the basis, well, then there isn't going to be anything on campus that happens that is pro-Palestinian. So it sounds like it was an association with some group.
No one knows who this account was, actually.
So
Well, that's
we'll have
often
time for
the case.
questions too. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to. This is.
Can I say one thing
Yes,
about that,
please,
though?
please.
Keep in mind, no matter what you think of Quad or not, which I'm not even sure it exists anymore, maybe it does, what that really means is there is no possible response to any kind of protest or action on campus that in any way involves Quad without calling in the police. You are basically saying you will not negotiate with students.
So, we're at the stage where we are with this agreement with the administration, and I've heard all sorts of different kinds of, just from reporting around campus, about the means through which there is such degree for leverage across the university by threatening to go to the Trump administration. And this is taking place, I've heard it with respect to the law school. I've heard it with respect to, there was a very public letter over the summer from one of the trustees asking for a deal to be struck between the school, between the university and the Trump administration. And not long after that, you see Elise Stefanik, who's featured in this film and has played a role in so much of this, come out and release these text messages from the university related to this trustee and other issues. And there's, a lot of evidence that there's a real card to be held, in the context of this agreement, and that affects not just speech, but operations here at the university. And I'm sure that the university would have comment on that, that they would have a response to that this is something that, they would want to answer with. So if you're a reporter here in the audience, I know there are many of you here, I really encourage you to reach out to the university to ask about these kinds of things, and to include and understand, the responses that they give to them. But I also want to go back to, I think, what is some good news in terms of thinking through the First Amendment. And I want to turn back to you, Ramya, and have you sort of lay out for everyone what the outcome of AAUP v. Rubio has been.
Yeah, well, we had this big victory in the case. In a really powerful opinion, Judge Young, he's a judge in a federal district court in Massachusetts, after hearing all of this testimony over a 2-week trial, found that this policy of ideological deportation that the administration has been engaged in, this campaign of intimidation that involves arresting, detaining, and deporting foreign students and faculty based on their pro-Palestinian advocacy, that it violates the First Amendment. And he found that the whole intent and effect of this policy has been to chill lawful political protest and to terrorize non-citizens into silence. He made extensive findings of fact on that. And the sort of legal conclusion at the heart of his opinion is on whether non-citizens have First Amendment rights. He sort of sets up the case as answering this question, whether non-citizens have the same First Amendment rights as citizens do. And he answers that question emphatically, yes, which is I mean, I think it's right on the law, but it was really powerful to have it set out the way that he set it out. And having reached that conclusion, he could not help but find that this policy of deporting people based on their political expression is a brazen violation of the First Amendment that he called, virtually unknown to our constitutional tradition. So he was as persuaded, I guess, by the testimony he heard at trial as the legal team who worked on the case was. And his opinion really channeled a lot of the outrage that I think a lot of us have been feeling watching what the administration has been doing. Usually trial judges in general are very careful to stick to the case at hand in their opinions, but he kind of reaches out beyond this case to situate it within this larger context of the Trump administration's broader attacks on free speech and higher education. And I think implicitly is expressing just fear that I think a lot of us are having about the future of democracy.
Yes, and just to quote from that ruling, he has this sort of, as you described it to me, a call to arms. He wrote this judge. President Trump believes the American people are so divided that today they will not stand up, fight for, and defend our most precious constitutional values so long as they are lulled into thinking their own personal interests are not affected. And he sort of concludes this passage, which I would encourage you to read, with this question: is that correct? And right before, as we turn to questions, so now would be a good time to line up, I want to ask both of you, do you believe that that's correct?
No, I don't think it's correct. And I think in many ways, the existence of our case, the fact that the American Association of University Professors, the AUP, and MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, brought this case, the fact that we had these incredibly brave non-citizen scholars testify in our case to the chill that they have been experiencing in the face of real fears of retaliation from an administration that is being quite transparently vengeful against so many of its political opponents. The very existence of this case, I think, is the refutation of this assumption that he attributes to President Trump, that people aren't willing to fight for their freedoms and to defend democracy.
All right. We have so much interest in questions. That's lovely. Let's start with you. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you so much for. Oops.
Not the only one.
And by the way, I know I don't need to tell you this, but a question is a question, meaning it is a statement, it is a sentence, it has a question mark at the end, but obviously make it a smart and great one.
No pressure. Yeah, thanks so much for this event. I wanted to ask, especially Professor El-Haj, there's a moment in the movie when an insider says that he felt like he said that he could not publish the number of Palestinians that were killed. And I was wondering if you speak a little bit, how come that even simple facts can become so controversial? How come that certain words and certain phrases can be seen as anti-Semitic, whereas on the other side, even more charged sentences are generally not questioned? Who has the right to narrate, and what are the forces that can lead to this situation? Thank you.
Really good question. Look, I don't know that I have the why, but that has certainly been the common sense in the US. There's you have to think about the crackdown on the student movement and on speech in general around the question of Palestine as an incredibly, the strength of that reaction is due to the strength of the movement itself in cracking open criticism of Israel that has long been virtually impossible in the American mainstream, right? And I don't know who that administrator was, but besides the sort of disciplinary moves that the administrations did from the get-go, the fact that both the Columbia president and the Barnard president kept sending out messages that specifically named Israeli victims and never once even used the word Palestinian set a tone of incredible confrontation as well. And if you look back at University Communications, it wasn't just that they wouldn't count the number of dead. Palestine does not appear, and Palestinians do not appear in their statements. And it's a certain kind of, I think that they definitely felt that they would get blowback if they did, and they're not willing to take that political blowback, right? I don't know if that's an answer, but I think that's what it is.
Sophie.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a student at the J School. It's a very strange feeling to start at this school in the immediate aftermath of such an enormous communal effort and experience. So I'm wondering how those of us joining now, with access to Columbia's campus, with Columbia IDs, how can we use our position to help continue the effort to protect the First Amendment here?
I love that question. I'll answer from a journalism perspective, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts too. But first of all, just your presence here means so much. Your questions mean so much. I mean, I've tried to, obviously I'm here as a moderator, but I've tried to pull in parts of my reporting at various points and, and to share them with you, but also to encourage you to do reporting, to contact sources, to get to know students. The student crackdown continues, and I think it's so important for you to follow that beat and also to understand how much room is there here for space on campus. From the get-go, from the very beginnings of this conversation, I said this is a counter narrative to a dominant narrative, and there are so many conversations that you can have, and the number one piece of advice, and I've had Sophie as a student, so I can tell you she's a phenomenal reporter. She has a great story in Semaphore right now that I would encourage you all to read about Afghanistan, and it's incredible. Please read. And just do the work, do the reporting, get to know the sources, these talents you're honing, especially those of you who are here as journalism school students. Continue to do that reporting and ask the questions that you're asking and bring your mind and your inquiry. And I know it can be difficult to have these conversations, especially in the context of, we're hearing about Canary Mission, and even reporters have been put on Canary Mission simply for reporting. I mean, this happened to student reporters who were just, if you look at the Canary Mission page, it just says that, so-and-so was seen filming inside the encampment. I know that can be incredibly intimidating. So if you're an international student and you're concerned about that, come talk to me for advice on how you might be able to do reporting more safely. But your presence here, your brilliant question, your incredible reporting, all of that is exactly what I would love to see all of you empowered to continue doing.
Well, I love all of Azmat's ideas. I think whether you're a reporter or not, developing literacy around what your rights are on campus by reading very closely Columbia's policies and tracking how they're changing, potentially in response to this settlement agreement, both policies around speech and when and where you're able to engage in it, and then the disciplinary policies as well, and finding the groups on campus that are engaging on these issues and that are fighting to defend the mission of higher education at Columbia, but also at universities more generally. I know the AUP and many labor unions associated with campus are doing amazing work on this, but I'm sure that there are student groups doing that work too. And then please stay engaged with the Knight Institute. We have a variety of events and programming about free speech, and some of that touches on campus.
And if I can just say a few words about the Palestine question and Palestine activism. I think it's really easy, well, it is easy because I feel that way sometimes too. It's really easy to be on campus now and feel like, oh my God, they just broke that movement, right? But the reality is, it was unsustainable even for the students. It was an entire year where people just, there were people who didn't graduate, people who dropped out of their classes. It was a kind of movement that was in emergency mode, and I think no one imagined that the genocide would continue this long. So, and I think it was world historical. I mean, it was part of transforming, that student movement was transformational in ways that the politics on Palestine and the sort of general understanding of the Israeli state in relation to Palestine is not going back. That genie isn't going back into the bottle, right? But I think the question that people started struggling with last year because they were exhausted, even then they were expelled, whatever, but is how do you sustain a movement for the medium term? And what does that need to look like? I don't have an answer, but I really feel like we cannot sort of comply in anticipation, right? There's a lot of anticipatory compliance, and different people are in different positions of vulnerability, and one has to assess one's own, but I really worry about anticipatory compliance. So whatever it is, what does it take to keep the conversation alive? Is Columbia the right object now, or does one really have to take it? Mamdani's win is a big win, right? What does it mean to take it to the sort of politicians and the political sphere, et cetera? But it didn't fail. It's up against, that was an incredible movement, and it really, we're not going back to pre-October 7th as a general consensus of Israel as a kind of the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. That's over.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm a little short for this, but first of all, I wanted to thank you for having this event regardless of cancellations. I think I kind of want to acknowledge that for me, it also feels very surreal to be watching this movie on Columbia's campus, just meters away from where everything took place. But I think something that I feel as a thread with this, and then also that I saw through the encampments, and then I think connects to this idea of kind of sustainability and how can first years get involved, is the encampments were a great place of passing on knowledge, of suddenly you had community members who had to take on a role that they weren't prepared for, and people were able to kind of pass knowledge and information about past movements and current movements. And something that at the rally today struck out to me is one of the demands is to open the gates. And I had a lot of students ask me, what do you mean open the gates? Because these are first years who've never experienced Columbia without the gates. Yeah.
Well, and by the way, the locked gates is what allows them to use security, because if the gates were open, you don't have to tell them who's coming onto campus. It's the perfect solution.
So I guess, I know you said you don't have an answer to the sustainable movement, but I guess how can we, and someone pointed out also a lot of students here may not know what quad is. And how do we continue to pass on this knowledge and ensure that these things get passed down, that students aren't kind of getting lost in the cracks to be asking, what do you mean the gates need to be opened? So that doesn't really have a question mark at the end, but I tried.
No, it did. It did.
Thank you.
I will say that when there is something you want to learn about, I would raise it. What is first of all, it's just understanding what capacity there is to have space for those kinds of conversations and gatherings. There is a lot of reporting, on these subjects, on the closure of the gates, on the litigation ongoing, especially by elderly people who live in the neighborhood and have to walk around. I had a student who actually worked on a really great story about its impact on commercial businesses on both sides of the university. And, obviously there is that, finding of subjects that you care about, the reporting on them, the reading of them, the raising of, obviously people, I know there was great interest in this film, in so many other films. I'm trying to drum up interest for 7 hours of A Time to Stir. We'll see if it's probably something I have to screen in a much smaller room. But I would just say if there's things that you want to see and hear and, put a conversation together, propose it. I know there's someone in this room, from SIPA who's been working really hard to hold events, related to some of these subjects, and it can be hard to pull off. But I think that when they ultimately happen, or when you have those conversations, and when they're inclusive and people feel like they can share things, which I hope everyone in this room feels, I think it's just creating that space.
Thank you all so much for being here and for all that you do. Ramya, I'm curious how throughout Mohsen's case you've been thinking about the administration's role in failing to protect students in cases which I think we all knew were unlawful detentions at the time. The judicial system has now affirmed that. How have you been thinking about that throughout this case, even though it might not be tied to it directly?
Yeah, I mean, I think, something that Nadia pointed out is that unfortunately a lot of universities didn't show support in response to requests for it from these individual students in advance. Some universities, have been quite critical of the administration's actions here and have at least shown support for these students, amid their proceedings in which they have been fighting to get out of detention and in fighting their deportation. So Tufts University, for example, filed a declaration in Rumeysa Ozturk's case. And Georgetown, I think, has also been, critical of Badr Khan Suri's arrest. And I think that universities being vocal about, attacks on their student and seeing those attacks as attacks on the entire community, because they undermine the whole mission that these universities are trying to advance, I think is incredibly important. I also, I think that there are probably policies that, universities can put in place to help protect students from ICE raids and the like, ensuring that, ICE agents are not able to come onto campus without a judicial warrant. So these are all things that universities should be thinking about doing. But really, step one is being open and direct in your criticism of the administration when they are attacking your community. And unfortunately, a lot of universities are failing at step one.
Thank you.
And these are, I think, the last people lined up. These are the last three questions, if that works.
Hello. Oopsies. Well, I'll just hold it like this. So I was a student at UCLA, and in my senior year, the encampments on October 7th and all of this was spilling out, and I had the chance to go to the encampments there and see for myself what was happening. And I think what was so frustrating and so upsetting to me was how, if we're talking about integrity and journalism and how we choose to represent the full truth, I was consistently frustrated at how intentionally corporate news media, public news media was obfuscating from the truth on ground. The live streams, the footage that you see in this documentary, or if you see that you also see in the UCLA documentary, please watch if you guys have the chance. It's just a world apart from what you're seeing, even from bird's eye view shots and these like helicopter shots that you see. And I'm just wondering, how do we contend with this in the field of journalism? If the trusted and like the sort of mainstream news media sources are always kind of not holding true to what's actually happening. They're not giving the numbers. They're not showing what's happening, even in this country. How can we trust anything, and where do we go from here?
Well, I wouldn't not be a journalist. Certainly, I would, encourage you to find your community to, one of the trends that I've seen is that student reporting has been so immersed in these worlds. I personally really appreciated the reporting of The Spectator, the student newspaper, of WKCR, the radio station, and of our Columbia journalism students, some of whom covered, this here on campus, who are alumni and are here in this room right now. And, I can't answer for legacy media. What I can say is that there is a growing distrust for a number of reasons in legacy institutions, coupled with efforts by an administration to crack down on press as well. And there are fissures happening, and I think there are dramatic transformations happening both, within legacy media, but media ecosystems to begin with, and how reporting is done and what is told. But what I will say is this, is that I'm continuously heartened by people who turn to the roots of great journalism, which is to be there on the ground, to document and witness, as exactly as you're talking about. There's a great sort of redemption arc if you look back at history and you look back at narratives. One of the reasons I became a journalist was that I was in high school when the Iraq War started, and I watched what the news media did at that time and how it was covered, and it's hard to put into words, but it set me on the path that I'm on. And if you look at the work that I've done and the places where it was published, and the longer arc of what a true accounting and what honesty looks like, I can tell you that we don't always have it in real time. And it's I'm going to stop talking about a time to stir, I swear. But if you look back at the Vietnam era protests, and you look at how people were treated then and how reporting, and just go back and look at the reporting. There's a great oral history that Vanity Fair did and others have done, but take a look at strides over time, and maybe that historical context might help you see the future of which you're a part.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your time. And I think it's great, that we're having these events, because there seems to be a crackdown on any, event on Palestine. So it's my first year here at SIPA, and I'm Palestinian. I initially, I had doubts whether I should come here or not, and amid everything that was going on, but of course I'm glad I did. And even though I do not have the lived experience of the past 2 years here, I can still sense the extreme level of repression that's on campus now. Not to kind of put us down or anything, but just being at a policy school and seeing in my classes that people are hesitant to even talk about Palestine or address this genocide is just disheartening. And the most I can do on my part, I feel, is still speak up, still bring it up, still make sure that our voices are heard. But I think the reason this is happening is just the crackdown and the fear mongering. Most of these students have a heart, have a mind, they know what's happening. They acknowledge that it's wrong, but people are afraid to speak, to engage in positive academic discourse. And I wonder what we can do to kind of change that, maybe more education on people's rights. Because, for me, this is personal. I know, I of course, we still need to be safe and everything, but I feel the need to speak up. Other people, might have more risks, might have other calculations, but I don't think it should be the case that you're not able to speak about this at a policy school. So I wonder what other remedies, can be made for this. And thank you.
I don't feel like I have an answer for anybody's questions tonight, but that was what was most extraordinary about the first year, right, 23, 24, is all sorts of people who had not, it wasn't that suddenly the dam broke on this opinion. I mean, I'm thinking about Palestine, that has been building for decades, right? But all sorts of people, and not just students, including colleagues who were always like, well, I don't really know anything about it, right? We always talk about things we don't know anything about, to be honest. We're academics, so, but not on this. Really, it broke a certain kind of reticence. And I think you're right. Now it's been sort of reclamped down on. But yeah, I don't know the answer. I mean, again, but I just think we have to just keep at it and just doing things on campus, even under conditions where, like tonight, it's ridiculous that we don't have Mahmoud here, right? But this has been a campus that has for a long time led a kind of opening a conversation on Palestine. I mean, Edward Said was here, and that's why so many of us are here, right? And I think the question is how not to concede that ground. And, you know, I don't know. But as students, like, I think part of the thing to think about is, as students, what are the kinds of things you can organize, right? They don't have to be demonstrations, but you can hold your own workshops or things at SEPA. And if they try to shut you down, then you talk to the AUP or me, right? I think you have to just think about what the margin of maneuver is and keep that up. But yeah, it's very frustrating.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm a little short. Thanks so much for being here. In the video response from former President Manoush Shafiq, she mentioned how Columbia isn't really the place to have, you know, greater discussions about larger geopolitical issues, and I was hoping you could comment on that.
I thought she was sort of saying, we're a mess, but of course we're a mess because we're not going to be able to solve this. It's bigger than us. So I don't think she was quite saying that, but she was trying to say it's not our fault. In other words, it wasn't her fault. I don't know. That was my reading of it.
I remember at that time, Olivia, that, and it's a great sort of question to put to, you know, like, can we? Like, I think where your question, it relates to parts of the conversation we've been having, which is, given what we've seen, and then what we've seen play out here in response, you know, in terms of Canary Mission, these students being harassed, targeted, doxxed, the role in which that, you know, turned into this ideological deportation, and the various threats we're seeing to students, but also to the ability, I mean, I referenced it several times. There's a Spectator article today, you know, about this event and the lead up to it, and the ability to have Mahmoud on campus. And, you know, I revealed to you that this has been the most elaborate process that I have ever undergone for an event. And I don't know if it's because of our co-sponsors or if it's because of, you know, what it was that, you know, no, yeah, but for me, it was such an ordeal. And it, you know, in the lead up to this, I was thinking, you know, I was like, wow, like, I don't want to do this again, but I have to do this again, you know? And I guess the sort of like, can we have these conversations? Yeah, we can if people are willing to. And I think it goes back to that judge who was thinking that people are so divided that they think, you know, that people are banking on this idea that we're not going to try to create those conversations or have that space or, you know, do why people come to campuses in the first place, right? For inquiry, for learning, for study. And, you know, you see it in the film where people are trying to self-study. And, you know, it's something Mahmoud Khalil mentioned recently where he said, you know, he basically said something the equivalent of, we had the gumption to take learning into our own hands. And, you know, I don't know, you know, what some administrator or president or leader might want. I just know that when there's really collective interest in being imaginative, of trying things, of exploring things, and honestly being willing to take risk, right? To stand up for what we believe in. And for me as a reporter, it's different. It's for the First Amendment, it's for reporting, it's for the ability to learn and uncover things and share them with the public and challenge false narratives and do accountability reporting. You know, all of that is central to this. So I hope that helps, and I hope that, you know, wherever you are here, if you're a student at Columbia, if you're affiliated in some other way, that you're trying in your own capacity as well, because it can feel so easy to get sort of beaten down or to feel like it's not worth it. But, you know, I'd love to hear from the two of you. I know the Knight Institute, which is affiliated with Columbia, and it's this premier, very formidable organization. I am obsessed with their work. Like, they're the ones who brought this litigation. That is so powerful if you think about it. I don't know how much people dwell on that concept, but they're the ones who have now. Actually, I'd want to maybe turn to you for a question, which is, you're now at the stage in that case where you're asking for remedy. What are you asking for?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a good wish list. I mean, at the bare minimum, what the court needs to do is to block the administration from continuing these ideological deportations. We need effective relief against that, and that means ordering them to stop, which then sets up the groundwork for possible contempt if they don't comply. We also seek, usually when you get a ruling like this, you'd seek a declaration simply that the conduct at issue violates the First Amendment. We've sought a more detailed, what we call declaration. We want the court to make it crystal clear that all the categories of speech that John Armstrong and other senior government officials testified could expose you to immigration enforcement are absolutely protected by the First Amendment, no matter what label the government attaches to it, whether it's anti-Semitic or anti-American or pro-terrorist. These categories of speech are protected, and the government can't deport you on the basis of it. And then we also seek a series of notice and transparency requirements that are meant to ensure that we can ensure that the government is complying with the court's rulings here, and effectively address the chilling effect that the administration's actions have caused, which entail students knowing what their rights are. So, for example, one of the notice requirements that we seek is that the government has to tell every student when they're granted a visa, or even when they apply, that their political advocacy is protected by the First Amendment, and the federal government is prohibited from taking immigration enforcement action against them based on it, which gives them, hopefully, the tools to enforce their rights should they need to, but also hopefully has a deterrent effect on the administration.
Well, we are hitting time, so let's please, Ramya and Nadia, thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you. Thank you all for sticking it out.